Hey guys, tonight we are building a Leviathan. The land is safe, but the sea is a chaotic wilderness. To survive it, we must build a fortress that floats. We are joining the medieval shipwright. We are going to engineer the massive wooden curves that carried humanity across the unknown. This is a story about oak, iron, and the hydrodynamics of survival. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Now, smell the hot tar, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The wharf awakens before dawn, when the mist still clings to the river's surface like a shroud. You can hear it first, before you see it. The rhythmic striking of mallets against wood, the groaning complaint of timber being shaped, the hiss of steam escaping from boxes where planks are softening into submission. This is not a quiet place. This is not a gentle craft. This is where men wrestle with the bones of the forest and convince them to float. The shipyard stretches along the muddy bank, open to the sky, unprotected from the elements. There are no roofs here, no shelter from rain or sun. The work is too large, too sprawling, too ambitious to be contained within walls. The skeleton of the ship rises from the mud like the ribcage of some ancient beast, stripped clean and waiting to be clothed in flesh. Except here the flesh is oak, 3 inches thick, 4 inches, sometimes more. Planks that took a century to grow, hewn down in an afternoon, shaped over weeks, fitted with a precision that would make a cathedral builder nod in recognition. The smell hits you before you've walked 10 paces into the yard. It is a complex thing, this smell. Layered. Salt from the river, carried on the wind that never stops blowing here at the water's edge. Sawdust, both fresh and old, the sweet scent of newly cut oak mixing with the mustier smell of wood that has been sitting in piles for seasons, waiting its turn. And underneath it all, penetrating everything, soaking into your clothes and your hair and the very pores of your skin, is the thick, cloying, almost overwhelming scent of boiling pitch. The pitch cauldrons bubble day and night at the far end of the yard. Great iron pots, blackened from years of use, suspended over fires that are never allowed to go out completely. The pitch inside is black as midnight, viscous as honey, hot enough to raise blisters on unprotected skin. It bubbles slowly, deliberately, sending up small puffs of dark smoke that smell of pine forests and eternity. This is what will keep the sea out. This is what will seal the gaps between planks, fill the spaces where water would otherwise creep in and rot the wood from within. The pitch is as essential to the ship as the timber itself. You can feel the mud beneath your feet, thick and clinging, churned into a paste by the boots of 100 workers who have crossed this ground today alone. In places, it sucks at your soles, reluctant to let you pass. In other places, it has been trampled so thoroughly that it has taken on the consistency of wet clay. Planks have been laid down to create rough pathways, but they shift and settle with each footfall, never quite stable, never quite trustworthy. The skeleton rises before you now, and you can see the ambition of it. This will be a cog, one of the workhorses of the northern seas. Broad in the beam, deep in the hold, built to carry cargo and withstand the brutal weather of the North Sea and the Baltic. It is not a sleek thing, not a fast thing. Speed is not what we are building here. We are building survival. We are building a wooden box that can be thrown against waves as tall as houses and emerge intact on the other side. The framework is already in place. The stem rises at the bow, curving upward and back like the neck of a swan. The stern post stands at the rear, massive and solid, the foundation upon which the rudder will eventually hang. Between them, ribs of oak arch upward and outward, defining the shape that the hull will take. These ribs, these frames, they were not cut to shape, not carved from straight timber into curves. No, they were found. Out in the forest, a shipwright walks with an eye trained by decades of experience, looking not at the trunk of the tree, but at the places where branches meet trunk, where the grain twists and turns naturally, where the wood has grown into the exact curve needed for a ship's frame. We do not force the wood into shapes it does not want to take. We find the shapes it has already grown into and put them to use. But before the ribs, before the frames, before any of this rising skeleton could be assembled, there had to be a foundation. There had to be a spine. There had to be a keel. The search for the keel tree begins months before the first timber is ever placed. It begins in the forest, deep in the oak groves where the trees have stood for longer than anyone can remember. The master shipwright walks among these giants with a practiced eye, always looking for the one. It must be oak, of course. Nothing else will do. Pine is too soft, too prone to rot. Elm twists as it dries. Ash is too brittle. But oak is eternal. Oak is strength. Oak will outlive the men who cut it, the men who shape it, the men who sail upon it. But not just any oak will serve as a keel. It must be massive, first of all. 100 feet long if you can find it, though 70 will do for a smaller vessel. It must be straight, unnaturally straight for a tree, with minimal taper from base to crown. It must be free of major branches for the first 40 or 50 feet of its height. It must be sound, with no rot in the heartwood, no splits from winter ice, no hollow chambers where water has found its way in and done its slow work of destruction. When the tree is finally chosen, when the master shipwright has walked around it a dozen times, placed his hands on its bark, looked up into its canopy and down at its roots, when he has finally nodded and said yes, this one, this is when the real work begins. The felling of a keel tree is not a quick thing. You do not simply notch it and push. A tree this size, this old, this deeply rooted, it demands respect. It demands time. The woodsmen arrive with their axes, edges honed to a sharpness that can split a hair, handles worn smooth by generations of hands. They begin on the uphill side, if there is a slope, cutting a mouth into the trunk that will determine the direction of the fall. The axes rise and fall with a rhythm that is almost musical. Chip after chip flies away. The cut grows deeper, wider. The heartwood begins to show, darker than the sapwood, harder, denser, the very core of the tree's strength. The work continues for hours, sometimes days, if the tree is particularly massive. The woodsmen rotate through, fresh arms replacing tired ones, but the rhythm never changes. The mouth of the cut grows deep enough that a man could stand inside it, and still they cut. And still the tree stands, held upright by the thickness of wood that remains at the back of the cut. When the moment finally comes, when the last few inches are all that remain, the master shipwright himself takes up an axe. He studies the tree one final time, checking the wind, checking the balance, checking everything that can be checked. And then he begins the final cut from the back. Slowly, carefully, the tree begins to groan. It is a sound unlike any other, a deep, resonant protest that seems to come from the very earth itself. The groan grows louder. The tree begins to lean. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, and then faster and faster still. And then it is falling, crashing down through the canopy of its neighbors, bringing down branches and birds' nests and a shower of leaves and acorns. And finally, it strikes the ground with an impact you can feel through the soles of your feet half a mile away. The sound of the impact rolls across the forest like thunder, and then there is silence. The birds have stopped singing. The wind seems to have paused. Even the woodsmen stand quiet for a moment, paying respect to the giant that has fallen. This tree was old when their grandfathers were young, and now it is down, and now it will become a ship. But first it must be made square. A round log will not do for a keel. The keel must have flat sides, must be hewn into a rectangular section that will provide a stable base for all the timbers that will be joined to it. This is the work of the adze, and it is brutal, unforgiving work. The adze is not like an axe. An axe is swung from the shoulder, using the weight of the tool and the strength of the back. An adze is swung between the legs, the blade arcing down to strike the wood between the worker's own feet. It requires a precision and confidence that comes only from years of practice. One miscalculation, one slip of the blade, and you have buried the adze in your own shin. The log is rolled and blocked into position, roughly where the shipwright wants the first face to be. The scribe has already marked a line down the length of the log, using a chalk line snapped taut and then released to leave a white mark on the bark. This line represents where the hewn surface will be. Everything outside this line must be removed. The first worker steps up to the log, adze in hand. He plants his feet wide, one on each side of the log, and begins. The adze rises above his head, pauses for just a fraction of a second at the top of the arc, and then falls. The blade bites into the wood with a solid thunk that you feel as much as hear. A chip of oak flies away, sailing several feet before landing in the growing pile of debris. The worker steps forward a few inches. The adze rises again, falls again. Thunk. Another chip. Step forward, rise, fall, thunk. The rhythm is hypnotic. Thunk, step, thunk, step, thunk, step. The blade flashes in the dappled sunlight that filters through the remaining trees. The worker's shirt is already dark with sweat despite the cool air. This is hard work, the kind that makes your shoulders burn and your hands cramp and your back scream for mercy. But the rhythm cannot be broken. Break the rhythm, and you break the flow. And breaking the flow means the surface will be uneven, means there will be high spots and low spots, means the keel will not be true. The first face takes days to hew. The log is 40 inches across at the base, tapering to perhaps 30 inches at what will become the bow end. Every inch of this must be worked by hand, the adze biting away oak in chips no larger than a playing card. Slowly, slowly, the round surface becomes flat. You can see the grain of the wood now, revealed by the adze blade, running in long, straight lines down the length of the log. This is what you want to see. Straight grain means strength. Means the wood will not twist or warp as it seasons. Means this keel will be true 100 years from now. When the first face is finally finished, the log is rolled. This is no small undertaking. Oak is heavy, brutally heavy, and this log weighs as much as a dozen oxen. Levers are employed, thick timbers used as pry bars, driven under the log and heaved upon by multiple men working in concert. Slowly, reluctantly, the log begins to turn. Blocks are wedged underneath to prevent it from rolling back. More heaving, more wedging. Gradually, inch by inch, the log rolls over until the next face is uppermost. The chalk line is snapped again. The adze rises and falls again. Thunk, step, thunk, step. The second face begins to take shape. 4 faces in total must be hewn. Each one requires the same painstaking work, the same endless rhythm of adze against oak, the same growing piles of chips that will later be gathered and used for kindling or packing or a dozen other purposes. Nothing is wasted, cannot afford to be wasted. This tree took a century to grow. Every scrap of it will be used. When the final face is complete, when the keel lies square and true, it must be measured. The shipwright arrives with his measuring rods, long poles marked with notches and scratches that represent standard measurements known only to him and his apprentices. He lays the rods along the length of the keel, checking for straightness. He measures the width at multiple points, ensuring consistency. He sights down the length, his eye trained to detect even the slightest deviation from true. If he is satisfied, the keel will be moved to the yard. This is another monumental undertaking. The forest may be miles from the water. The keel must be transported on a sledge, pulled by teams of oxen, inching along rough tracks that may have to be cleared or even built specifically for this purpose. It takes days, sometimes weeks. The procession moves at a walking pace, slower when the ground is soft or the slope is steep. Men walk alongside with ropes and levers, ready to intervene if the sledge begins to slip or the keel begins to shift. When it finally arrives at the yard, there is a palpable sense of relief. The foundation of the ship has arrived. The spine around which everything else will be built is here. But it cannot simply be left on the ground. The keel must be elevated, must be set on blocks that will hold it at precisely the right height and precisely the right level. The blocks are prepared with obsessive care. They are oak as well, thick squared timbers cut to exact heights. They are positioned along the line where the keel will lie, spaced evenly, checked and rechecked with levels and plumb lines. The ground beneath each block is dug out and filled with gravel, tamped down hard to prevent settling. Each block is set perfectly level to its neighbors. This is critical. If the keel is not level, nothing built upon it will be true. When the blocks are ready, the keel is lifted into place. This requires every able-bodied man in the yard and then some. Ropes are fastened around the keel at multiple points. Teams of men take up positions on either side. On the count, they heave. The keel rises perhaps an inch off the ground. Blocks are slid underneath. On the count, they heave again. Another inch. More blocks. Again. Again. Slowly, agonizingly, the keel rises until it is at the height of the waiting blocks. Now comes the delicate part. The keel must be shifted sideways, must be moved into position directly above the blocks. This is done with levers and wedges and an infinite amount of patience, a quarter inch at a time, checking the alignment, adjusting, checking again. Hours pass. The sun moves across the sky. Men's backs ache and their hands blister and their patience wears thin. But finally, the keel is positioned correctly. The order is given to lower. The ropes are paid out slowly, carefully, evenly on all sides. The keel descends. It touches the first block. Weight begins to transfer. More blocks make contact. The keel settles, its full weight now resting on the blocks that will support it throughout the building process and beyond. The master shipwright approaches with his measuring tools. He checks the level along the length of the keel, checks it across the width, places his eye at one end and sights down the length to the other end. He walks around the keel multiple times, examining it from every angle. And finally, he nods. The keel is true. The keel is level. The keel is ready. This single timber, this spine of oak, will determine the character of everything that follows. If it is straight, the ship will track true through the water. If it is strong, the ship will survive the stresses of cargo and waves and years of service. If it is properly seated, properly supported, the ship will not hog or sag as it ages. Everything depends on this first timber being right. And so we take our time. We measure twice and cut once. We check and recheck. We do not hurry. The keel is the beginning, but it is not the only critical element. A ship is not simply a straight line of wood. A ship curves and bends, rises and falls, follows the complex geometry that allows it to move through water rather than simply sitting atop it. To create these curves, we need the knees. The knees are the brackets of the ship. They are the L-shaped pieces that connect the horizontal to the vertical, the floor to the wall, the deck beam to the frame. They are not small decorative elements. They are massive pieces of oak, sometimes 2 feet thick at the junction, shaped to transfer loads from one plane to another. And they are everywhere. In a ship this size, there may be 100 knees or more, each one critical to the structural integrity of the whole. But here is the thing about knees. We do not make them, not in the sense of cutting them from straight timber. You cannot take a straight plank and cut a right angle into it and expect it to be strong. The grain would run across the short arm, making it weak, prone to splitting under load. No, to make a proper knee, you must find the angle already present in the wood. You must go into the forest and search for the places where a branch meets the trunk at the angle you need. Because at that junction, the grain flows around the curve, follows the natural shape of the tree's growth, creates a strength that cannot be replicated by cutting. This is specialized knowledge, and it belongs to the knee hunters. These are men who know the forest not as a place of trees, but as a warehouse of potential ship parts. They walk through the oak groves with an eye trained to see not what is, but what could be. That branch there, where it meets the trunk, is that a 60-degree angle? 70? 90? How thick is it? How long? Is the wood sound? They carry templates with them, rough L-shaped patterns cut from thin boards, representing the various angles and sizes of knees the ship will need. They hold these templates up against likely-looking branch junctions. checking the fit, assessing the potential. When they find a good candidate, they mark it. A slash of paint, a notch cut into the bark, some sign that this particular junction has been claimed for the ship. The marking of knees goes on for weeks, sometimes months. The knee hunters range far and wide, sometimes traveling days from the shipyard to access forests where the right shapes can be found. They become familiar faces to the forest wardens, explaining their purpose, gaining permission to mark and later cut specific branches. Sometimes they pay for the privilege. Sometimes arrangements are made to share other timber from the same tree. The economics of shipbuilding reach deep into the woods. When enough knees have been marked, the cutting begins. But you cannot simply saw off a branch at the junction and call it done. To get a proper knee, you must take a section of the trunk as well and a significant length of the branch. The rough blank might be 3 feet along the trunk, 3 feet along the branch, massively oversized for the final knee, but necessary to ensure you have good wood to work with. The cutting of knees is an art in itself. You must cut in such a way that you do not split the wood, do not damage the critical junction where branch meets trunk. Saws are used for the initial cuts, but carefully, slowly, with men on both sides of the cut to control the kerf and prevent binding. When the knee is finally free from the tree, it is enormously heavy, awkward to move, difficult to handle, but it contains within it a strength that will become part of the ship's bones. The rough knees are transported to the yard much like the keel, on sledges or carts, bumping along rough tracks. Once there, they are stacked near the workshop area where they will eventually be shaped. But first, they must season. Green wood is full of moisture, full of sap, and if you try to use it immediately, it will shrink and crack and warp as it dries. So the knees sit in their stacks, exposed to air and sun and rain, slowly releasing their moisture, slowly stabilizing. The shipwright is patient. He knows that rushing this process leads to problems later. Better to let the wood take its time, better to allow nature to do what nature does. Months pass. The knees weather from fresh-cut tan to a deeper brown. Cracks appear at the ends where the grain terminates, but these are expected, will be cut away when the knee is finally shaped. The wood becomes harder, denser, more stable. When a knee is finally ready to be shaped, it is selected from the stack and brought to the shaping area. This is not fine joinery. This is rough work, brutal work, removing large amounts of wood quickly to approximate the final shape. The adze comes out again, along with axes and saws and planes. The shipwright has a template for each knee, knows exactly what size and shape is needed, and where it will go in the ship. The rough blank is secured to a low bench or directly to the ground with wooden wedges. The template is placed on top, and the outline is traced with a scribe or chalk. Everything outside this line is waste and must be removed. The workers attack the blank with axes first, rough chopping away the obvious excess. Large chunks of oak fall away. The blank begins to take on a more recognizable shape, the L becoming more pronounced, the waste wood being removed. Then the adze is employed for finer work. The surfaces that will bear against other timbers must be reasonably flat, must make good contact. The adze works these faces, the blade rising and falling in that familiar rhythm, chips flying, the oak slowly submitting to the shape the shipwright demands. It takes hours for each knee. Some require days. The large ones, the massive ones that will support the deck beams at the widest point of the ship, these can require a week of steady work to shape properly. When a knee is finished, it is examined carefully. The grain is checked to ensure it flows correctly around the angle. The surfaces are checked for flatness, for square, for the proper dimensions. The knee is test-fitted to templates representing the places it will eventually join to other timbers. Only when everything is satisfactory is the knee approved and set aside with the other finished components. Slowly, the pile of finished knees grows. 60 knees, 80, 100. Each one represents hours of searching in the forest, hours of cutting and transporting, months of seasoning, days of shaping. Each one is unique, found in the forest already bearing the curve it will need to perform its function in the ship. We are not forcing the wood to do what it does not want to do. We are finding the wood that already wants to do what we need and putting it to use. This is the deeper wisdom of wooden shipbuilding. You cannot fight the wood. You cannot force it into shapes that violate its fundamental nature. The grain has a direction, has preferences about how it wants to bend and how it refuses to bend. If you work with the grain, if you find the natural curves and put them to use, the wood will reward you with strength and longevity. If you fight against it, if you try to impose your will through force, the wood will fail you when you need it most. The frames of the ship, the ribs that arch up from the keel and give the hull its shape, these too are found rather than made. They are assembled from multiple pieces, each piece a natural curve taken from the forest, fitted together to create the compound curves that define a ship's cross-section. A single frame might contain 4 or 5 separate pieces, each one shaped from a naturally curved branch or root, each one chosen specifically for the angle and size required. The assembly of the frames happens on the ground, near the keel but not yet attached to it. Each frame is laid out according to templates, the pieces positioned and checked and repositioned until everything is right. Then the pieces are fastened together with trunnels, wooden pegs driven through holes bored through overlapping sections of the frame pieces. The trunnels are made of oak as well, split from straight-grained stock, shaped roughly round, driven home with a heavy mallet. They swell when they get wet, locking themselves in place, becoming as much a part of the wood they join as the wood itself. Frame by frame, the skeleton of the ship takes shape on the ground. When a frame is complete, it is raised into position on the keel, its foot resting on the keel's upper surface, its top reaching up toward the sky. Temporary bracing is installed to hold the frame upright and in the correct position. Then the next frame is raised, and the next, working from the middle of the ship outward toward the ends. The spacing between frames is critical. Too close and you waste wood and time. Too far apart and the planking will not be adequately supported. The master shipwright has determined the spacing based on experience, based on knowledge passed down through generations. Frames every 3 feet perhaps, or every 4 feet, depending on the size of the ship and the expected loads it will carry. As the frames go up, the shape of the ship begins to emerge. You can see now how it will look, how the hull will curve from keel to gunwale, how it will narrow at the bow and stern, how it will swell amidships to create the maximum cargo capacity. The skeleton is beautiful in its own way, an expression of geometry and force and the materials available. This is not arbitrary. This is the shape that works, proven over centuries of trial and error and storm and survival. But frames and keel alone do not make a ship. The skeleton must be given skin. The hull must be planked. And this is where we encounter one of the central challenges of wooden shipbuilding. How do you make a straight plank bend around a curved hull? The planks are prepared in advance, sawn from straight-grained oak logs to a thickness of 3 or 4 inches and a width of 8 to 12 inches. They are as long as can be practically managed, 20 feet, 30 feet if you can get it, because every joint in the planking is a potential weak point, a place where water can seep in. The planks are stacked near the ship, organized by size and quality, ready to be fitted. The planking begins at the keel, with a plank called the garboard strake. This is the first plank on each side, and it must fit precisely against the keel along its lower edge and against the frames along its inner surface. The shipwright and his assistants offer up the plank to the frames, checking the fit, marking where wood must be removed to achieve good contact. The plank is taken down, worked with plane and adze, offered up again. This process repeats until the fit is satisfactory. But here is the problem. The frames are curved. They arc outward from the keel and then back inward as they approach the gunwale. A straight plank, even a flexible one, cannot simply be nailed to a curved frame and expected to stay put. It will spring back, will fight against the curve, will eventually pull free. To make a plank stay on a curve, you must change the fundamental nature of the wood. You must make it want to be curved. This is accomplished through heat and moisture, through steam. At the far end of the yard, near the pitch cauldrons but separate from them, sit the steam boxes. These are long wooden troughs, perhaps 30 feet in length, built of thick planks and sealed tightly so that steam cannot easily escape. At one end of each box, a fire pit has been excavated. Above the fire pit sits a large iron kettle filled with water. The kettle has a lid, and from the lid a wooden pipe leads into the steam box. The fire is lit and fed until it roars. The water in the kettle begins to heat, slowly at first, and then more vigorously. Small bubbles appear at the bottom of the kettle and rise to the surface, bursting with tiny hisses. The bubbling increases. The water begins to move, roiling, agitated by the heat beneath it. And then it reaches a full boil, water transforming into steam, rising, filling the space beneath the lid, building pressure, seeking escape. The steam has only one path, into the wooden pipe, and from there into the steam box. It enters the box with a hiss that can be heard across the yard. Wisps of white vapor begin to leak from joints in the box that are not perfectly sealed. The temperature inside the box begins to rise. 50 degrees, 60, 80, 100, higher still. When the steam box is good and hot, when the steam is pouring in steadily, when the leaks have been minimized and the whole apparatus is functioning as it should, the plank is introduced. This requires several men working together. The steam box has a door at one end, held shut by simple wooden bars. These are removed. The door is swung open, releasing a cloud of steam into the cold air. The plank, which has been waiting nearby, is lifted by workers stationed along its length. It is heavy, awkward, unwieldy. On the command, they move toward the steam box, feeding the plank in end first, walking it into the box like threading a needle with a very large, very heavy thread. When the plank is fully inside, the door is closed and barred. The steam begins its work. Inside the box, in the hot, moist darkness, the plank begins to change. The heat penetrates the wood, millimeter by millimeter. The moisture follows, seeping into the cell structure of the oak. The lignin that gives wood its rigidity begins to soften. The fibers that normally resist bending begin to relax. The wood, so stiff and unyielding when it entered the box, begins to become pliable. This does not happen instantly. Thick oak like this requires time in the steam. An hour, perhaps, sometimes longer. The workers wait, tending the fire, ensuring the water in the kettle does not boil dry, watching for problems. The master shipwright observes, his experience telling him when enough time has passed, when the wood has been transformed as much as it can be. And then comes the moment of truth. The bars are removed from the door. The door swings open. The men rush in, hands wrapped in heavy leather to protect against the heat. They grasp the plank and pull it from the box as quickly as possible. Steam billows around them, making it difficult to see, difficult to breathe. The plank emerges, steaming, hot to the touch even through the leather gloves, and critically, temporarily flexible. There is no time to waste. The clock is now ticking. As soon as the plank leaves the steam box, it begins to cool. As it cools, it begins to stiffen. The window of opportunity in which the plank can be bent to the required curve and fastened in place is measured in minutes. Perhaps 10 minutes, perhaps 15 if you are lucky, but no more. The men carry the plank at a run toward the ship. Others are already waiting at the frames, clamps at the ready, trunnels prepared, mallets in hand. The plank is offered up to the frames, positioned carefully, held in place by multiple hands. The shipwright is there, directing, adjusting, ensuring the alignment is correct. This plank must overlap the one below it just so, must line up with the frames precisely, must follow the curve of the hull without gaps. The first clamp goes on, squeezing the plank against a frame at the middle of its length. The plank resists for a moment, then yields, bending to follow the curve. A second clamp, a third, working outward from the middle toward both ends. The plank groans as it bends. You can hear it, a deep, almost organic sound, the wood fibers stretching and compressing, protesting this unnatural shape even as the heat makes it possible. Now the trunnels are driven. A hole has already been bored through the plank and into the frame. The trunnel, a wooden peg perhaps an inch in diameter, is positioned at the hole and struck with a heavy mallet. It resists at first. The fit is intentionally tight, but the mallet strikes again and again, and slowly the trunnel drives home, passing through the plank and into the frame, locking the two together. More holes, more trunnels. The plank is being permanently fastened to the frames even as it cools, even as it stiffens. The work is frantic, urgent, driven by the knowledge that if the wood cools too much before it is secured, it will spring back, will refuse to hold the curve, and all the work will have been for nothing. Plank after plank, the process repeats. Heat the wood in steam until it becomes soft. Rush it to the ship. Bend it to the curve of the hull. Clamp it. Fasten it with trunnels before it cools. Each plank takes perhaps an hour from start to finish, including the time in the steam box. A large cog might require 200 planks or more to completely skin the hull. 200 steaming sessions. 200 frantic rushes to bend and fasten the hot wood. 200 opportunities for something to go wrong. And things do go wrong. Sometimes the wood is not heated enough, and when the men try to bend it to the frame, it snaps with a sound like a gunshot, the fibers fracturing, the plank ruined. Sometimes the wood is heated too much, and it becomes so soft that it compresses rather than bends, crushing under the pressure of the clamps. Sometimes the timing is off, and the wood cools before it can be properly fastened, and it springs back, pulling the trunnels loose or splitting where the trunnels hold it. Each failure is a lesson. Each failure teaches the shipwright and his crew something about the limits of the process, about how hot is too hot, about how fast they must work, about how to read the wood and know when it is ready. The knowledge is hard-won, purchased with ruined planks and wasted days and occasional injuries when hot wood or steam finds exposed skin. But slowly, plank by plank, the hull begins to take shape. The skeleton of frames begins to disappear beneath a skin of oak. The lower planks are in place, bent around the curve of the bilge, where the hull transitions from near vertical to near horizontal. The middle planks are going on, following the gentle swell of the hull amidships. Soon the upper planks will be fitted, and the hull will be complete from keel to gunwale. Each plank overlaps the one below it in a pattern called clinker or lapstrake construction. The overlap is typically 2 inches or so, enough to create a strong joint when the planks are fastened together along their length with iron rivets. The rivets are made by the smith, formed from iron rod, hammered into rough shape, and then finished by hand. Each rivet has a shaft and a head. The shaft passes through holes drilled through both planks where they overlap. On the inside of the hull, a washer called a rove is placed over the protruding end of the rivet shaft. Then the end is hammered, peened over the rove, creating a second head that locks the joint tight. The riveting is skilled work. The striker on the outside of the hull holds a heavy iron block called a dolly against the rivet head. Inside the hull, another worker strikes the protruding end of the rivet with a hammer, deforming it, spreading it over the rove. The dolly absorbs the impact, prevents the rivet head from being driven through the plank. The hammer blows must be precise, must spread the rivet end evenly, must create a head that will hold but not crack the wood. The sound of riveting rings across the yard. Clang, clang, clang. A rapid rhythm, multiple riveting teams working simultaneously at different points on the hull. The sound echoes off the ground, off the nearby buildings, creates a constant metallic backdrop to all the other sounds of the shipyard. It is the sound of construction, of progress, of a ship coming into being. As the planking rises higher, the curves become more complex. At the bow and stern, where the hull narrows and turns back on itself, the planks must be bent in 2 directions simultaneously, twisted as well as curved. This is the most difficult planking, requiring the longest time in steam, the most careful handling, the most skill in fastening. The wood fights harder here, resists more, demands more from the workers. But inch by inch, plank by plank, the shape emerges. The bow takes form, rising up from the keel, curving back in an elegant arc that will split the water and allow the ship to move forward with minimum resistance. The stern takes form, a bluff, squared-off end that will carry the rudder and provide maximum volume for cargo. The shear line emerges, the curve of the upper edge of the hull from bow to stern, rising slightly amidships and dipping at the ends, a curve that pleases the eye even as it serves a functional purpose, helping water shed off the deck, improving the ship's motion in a seaway. When the last plank is in place, when the final rivet has been peened, when the hull is complete from end to end and from keel to gunwale, there is a moment of satisfaction. The ship has been given its skin. The skeleton has been clothed. What was once a theoretical shape, existing only in the master shipwright's mind and in rough drawings, is now a physical reality. It exists. It occupies space. It has weight and presence and substance. But it is not finished, far from it. The seams between planks, even with the careful overlap and riveting, are not perfectly watertight. Water will find its way through, seeping between the planks, especially when the ship works in a seaway and the hull flexes slightly. This is where the caulking comes in. Caulking is the process of filling the seams with material that will exclude water. In northern European shipbuilding, the primary caulking material is tarred wool or hair, sometimes mixed with moss. The material is prepared in advance, wool fibers or animal hair teased apart and soaked in pine tar until they are thoroughly impregnated. The tar makes the fibers waterproof and helps them stick together. The caulking is driven into the seams using caulking irons and mallets. A caulking iron is a flat, blunt-edged tool shaped somewhat like a very dull chisel. The caulker takes a strand of tarred fiber, lays it along a seam, and then drives it into the gap between planks using the iron and mallet. The fiber compresses as it is driven, packing tightly into the seam, filling the void. More fiber is added, and driven, and more still, until the seam is completely packed and no more fiber can be forced in. The work is tedious, painstaking, and absolutely critical. A poorly caulked seam will leak, allowing water into the hull, soaking cargo, potentially sinking the ship if enough water accumulates. Every seam must be caulked, from the keel to the gunwale, from bow to stern. Hundreds of feet of seams, each one requiring careful attention, proper packing, adequate material. The sound of caulking is different from the sound of riveting. It is a softer sound, a series of light taps rather than heavy blows. Tap, 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 the caulking iron advancing along the seam, the mallet striking with just enough force to drive the fiber home, but not so much as to damage the wood or push the fiber through to the inside. Tap, 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 hour after hour, day after day, until every seam is filled. After the caulking comes the pitch. The pitch that has been bubbling in those iron cauldrons at the far end of the yard is finally put to use. Workers with brushes and mops apply hot pitch over the caulked seams, the black substance flowing into any remaining gaps, coating the tarred fiber, creating a waterproof seal. The pitch is applied liberally, coating not just the seams but the planks on either side, creating a black stripe that follows the line where planks meet. The smell of the hot pitch is overwhelming when you are close to it, acrid and sharp, and somehow primal. It gets on everything, on tools and clothes and skin. It does not wash off easily. The workers who apply it become stained with it, their hands and arms dark with pitch that no amount of scrubbing will completely remove. But when the pitch has been applied to every seam, when it has cooled and hardened, the hull is watertight. The ship can be launched. The planks that were bent around the frames while still hot from the steam barks have cooled and stiffened in their new shape. They will hold this shape now, even when removed from the frames, because the cooling process locks in the curve. The wood remembers its new form. Inside the hull, work continues. The frames must be reinforced with additional knees and braces. The deck beams must be installed, heavy timbers that span from one side of the hull to the other, providing support for the deck planking and preventing the hull from spreading under load. These beams are fitted into notches cut into the tops of the frames and are secured with large knees that bracket the junction between frame and beam. The deck beams are massive. At the widest point of the ship, a beam might be 40 feet long, a foot square in cross-section, weighing as much as several men. Installing them requires block and tackle, multiple workers, careful coordination. Each beam is lifted into position, maneuvered into its notches, checked for level and alignment, and then permanently fastened with trunnels driven through beam and frame. When all the deck beams are in place, the deck planking can begin. This is straightforward compared to the hull planking because the deck is flat, or nearly so, with only a slight camber from center to edge to help water run off. The deck planks are typically narrower than hull planks, perhaps 6 inches wide, and they are laid tight edge to edge with no overlap. The joints between planks are caulked just like the hull seams, with tarred fiber driven in and pitch applied over the top. The deck provides a working platform, allows cargo to be loaded and secured, gives the crew a place to stand while managing the sail and rigging. But it also serves a structural function, tying the two sides of the hull together, preventing the hull from racking or twisting when the ship is underway. Below the deck, the hold takes shape. This is the cargo space, and it must be maximized while still maintaining the structural integrity of the ship. Floors are laid across the lowest part of the hull, resting on top of the keel and extending out to the turn of the bilge. These floors provide a platform on which cargo can be stacked, keeping it up out of any water that might accumulate in the bilge. The bilge itself must be considered. No matter how well caulked, no wooden ship is perfectly watertight. Water will find its way in through seams, through the gaps around the rudder post, through 1,000 tiny pathways. This water collects in the bilge, the lowest part of the hull, and it must be removed periodically, or it will accumulate, adding weight, reducing cargo capacity, eventually soaking into the cargo and ruining it. The primary tool for removing bilge water is the pump. A ship this size will have a pump mounted near the mast, a wooden tube that extends down into the bilge with a plunger mechanism that can be worked by hand to lift water up and discharge it over the side. The pump is worked regularly, every day when the ship is at sea, keeping the bilge as dry as possible. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The ship is not yet in the water. It still sits on its blocks in the yard, supported by the same timbers that held the keel when construction began. To become a working vessel, it must be launched, and the launch of a ship this size is an event in itself. The ship must be moved from the building site to the water, a distance of perhaps 50 feet or 100 feet, depending on the layout of the yard. This is accomplished using a greased slipway, a ramp that slopes down to the water's edge. The slipway is built of heavy timbers, laid parallel to each other, and the whole surface is coated with tallow or grease to reduce friction. Before the launch, the ship must be prepared. Temporary supports are installed beneath the hull to prevent it from sagging or twisting when the keel blocks are removed. The blocks themselves are knocked out one by one, carefully, the ship's weight being transferred to the temporary supports. When all the blocks are removed, the ship rests entirely on the supports. Now the ship must be moved sideways, from the building site to the slipway. This is done using levers and rollers, inch by inch, the ship being pried and pushed and rolled until it is positioned over the slipway. The temporary supports are adjusted, keeping the ship stable as it moves. When the ship is finally on the slipway, positioned correctly, the supports are removed and the ship's weight settles onto the greased timbers. Restraining ropes are attached to keep the ship from sliding down the ramp prematurely. These ropes are controlled by teams of workers, the ropes running around posts or through pulley blocks to give mechanical advantage. The launch itself is carefully timed. The tide must be right, high enough that the ship will float free when it reaches the water, but not so high that the slipway is submerged and difficult to work with. The weather must be calm, or as calm as it gets on this coast. The workers must be ready, positioned at their ropes, alert and focused. When everything is ready, the master shipwright gives the signal. The restraining ropes are slowly paid out. The ship begins to move, sliding down the greased ramp toward the water. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, and then faster. The greased timbers squeal and smoke from the friction despite the tallow. The ship accelerates. The workers controlling the restraining ropes strain to keep the descent controlled, to prevent the ship from rushing down the ramp and hitting the water too hard. And then the bow reaches the water. It enters with a great splash, throwing up spray, the ship's weight pushing it deep for a moment before buoyancy takes over and lifts it back up. More of the hull enters the water, more and more, until finally the entire ship is afloat, freed from the ramp, floating free for the first time. The restraining ropes are released. The ship bobs in the water, settling into its natural trim, finding its balance. It floats. All those tons of oak and iron, all that weight of timber and caulking and pitch and iron fittings, it floats. The hull that was shaped over months, planked with wood that was steamed and bent and fastened, it displaces its weight in water and sits upon the surface as it was designed to do. There is always a moment of tension at a launch, a moment when everyone watches the water line, making sure the ship floats at the right depth, making sure there are no unexpected leaks, making sure the months of work have resulted in a vessel that is sound and seaworthy. If the ship sits too low in the water, it suggests the hull is heavier than calculated or that water is coming in somewhere. If it sits too high, the ballast calculations may be off. But this ship floats true, sits at the right depth, shows no signs of taking on water. The caulking holds. The seams are tight. The months of careful work have paid off. Finishing work still remains. The mast must be stepped, fitted into a massive block of timber called the mast step that rests on the keel and distributes the mast's weight and the forces from the sail across the hull structure. The rigging must be installed, the standing rigging that holds the mast in place and the running rigging that controls the sail. The rudder must be hung on the stern post, connected to the tiller that will allow the helmsman to steer the ship. The cabin must be built, providing shelter for the master and crew. Hatch covers must be constructed to protect the cargo hold. 1,000 details remain to be addressed. But the hull is complete. The ship exists. What was once a tree in the forest, 100 years growing, is now a ship, capable of carrying 40 tons of cargo across the northern seas. What was once separate pieces, keel and frames and planks and knees and beams, all found in the forest and shaped by hand, has been joined into a whole that is greater than its parts. This is the achievement of the medieval shipwright. With no power tools, no steam engines, no electric saws or drills, with only hand tools and experience and knowledge passed down through generations, they built ships that could survive the worst the ocean could throw at them. They understood wood, understood how it grew and how it behaved, understood that you could not force it but had to work with it, finding the natural curves and putting them to use. They understood steam and heat and timing, knew how to make the unbendable bend, knew how long they had before the wood cooled and stiffened. They understood structure and forces, knew where to put the knees and how to orient the grain, knew how to build a hull that would flex slightly in a seaway but not break, that would give a little but always return to true. And they did all this in the open air, in the mud, in the rain and wind, working through seasons, through years sometimes for the largest ships, never giving up, never cutting corners, because they knew that lives would depend on the quality of their work. When this ship sailed north into the Baltic or west into the North Sea, when it encountered storms that towered above the mast and waves that buried the bow, the survival of the crew would depend on whether the shipwright had chosen his timbers wisely, had steamed his planks long enough, had driven his trunnels home properly, had caulked every seam thoroughly. There is no room for approximation in shipbuilding, no room for good enough. The ocean is not forgiving. It will find every weakness, exploit every flaw, and when it does, men die. So the shipwright takes his time, measures twice, checks and rechecks, uses the best materials he can find, applies the techniques that have been proven over centuries. He builds not for calm seas, but for the storm, not for light loads, but for heavy cargo, not for a season, but for decades of service. And when the ship is complete, when it finally sails away from the yard carrying its first load of cargo, the shipwright watches it go with a mixture of pride and apprehension. Pride in the work, in the knowledge that this thing he has built with his hands and his mind will serve its purpose, will carry goods and people safely across the water. Apprehension because he knows that no matter how careful he was, no matter how thorough, there is always a chance something was missed, some flaw undetected, some weakness that will only reveal itself under load or in a storm. But he has done his best, has applied all his knowledge and skill, and now the ship must prove itself. The ocean will be the final judge. The ocean will test every joint, every plank, every knee, every trunnel. The ocean will find what the shipwright might have missed. But if the shipwright has done his work well, if he has followed the old ways and used good materials and taken his time, the ship will endure. It will survive storms and groundings and years of hard use. It will become a familiar sight in ports along the coast, a reliable hauler of cargo, a safe passage for merchants and sailors. It will, in time, become old and worn, will require constant maintenance and repair, will eventually be broken up for salvage or left to rot in some forgotten creek. But for now, newly launched, still smelling of fresh pitch and cut oak, it is perfect. It is the embodiment of all the shipwright's knowledge and skill. It is a fortress that floats, a wooden box that can survive the chaotic wilderness of the sea. It is what humanity has learned to build through trial and error, through centuries of drownings and survivals, through the accumulated wisdom of countless shipwrights who came before and passed down their knowledge to the next generation. And in this moment, watching the ship bob gently at its mooring, the shipwright knows that his work will outlive him. Long after he is gone, this ship will still be sailing, still carrying cargo, still serving the purpose for which it was built. This is his legacy, solid and real and floating before him. This is what his hands have made. The yard is quieter now with this ship launched. The workers are beginning to clean up, to organize tools, to prepare for the next project, because there is always a next project. The demand for ships never stops. Trade must continue, goods must be moved, fishing fleets must be maintained. And so the cycle begins again. Trees are marked in the forest. Timber is cut and hauled to the yard. A new keel is laid. A new skeleton begins to rise from the mud. But for tonight, for this moment, we can rest in the knowledge that we have built well. We have taken the forest's strength and shaped it to our purpose. We have made the straight curve and the hard soft, have joined timber to timber with such precision that water cannot find its way through. We have built a leviathan, a fortress against the chaos of the sea. And tomorrow, when the ship is loaded with its first cargo, and the crew bends the sail to the yard, and the helmsman puts the tiller over, and the bow begins to swing toward open water, we will watch from the shore and know that our work is good. The ship will leave the safety of the harbor and venture out into the unknown, and it will survive because we built it to survive. This is our craft. This is our skill. This is the legacy we pass to the next generation. The ocean awaits, patient and eternal. The wind fills the sail. The ship begins to move, and with it our hopes and our pride and the proof of our labor. We are the shipwrights, the builders of fortresses that float, the engineers of oak and iron, and our work endures. But let us return to the steam box, for there is more to understand about this critical process, more to appreciate about the delicate balance between heat and time and pressure that allows us to reshape oak. The steam box is not simply a container with hot vapor inside. It is a carefully designed instrument, the product of generations of refinement, of lessons learned through failures that resulted in snapped planks and wasted days, and sometimes injured workers. The wood of the steam box itself must be thick, resistant to the constant exposure to heat and moisture that would rot lesser timber in months. The joints must be tight enough to contain the steam, but not so tight that pressure builds to dangerous levels. There must be drainage, small holes at the lowest point where condensed water can escape, because water pooling in the bottom of the box will rob heat from the steam and create cold spots where planks will not heat evenly. The fire that boils the water must be carefully tended. Too small and the steam production cannot keep pace with the losses through the inevitable leaks and gaps. The temperature inside the box drops. The wood fails to reach the necessary heat, and when the plank is removed and bent, it fractures instead of flowing. Too large a fire and the water boils away too quickly, requiring constant attention to refill the kettle, wasting fuel, creating a risk that the kettle could boil dry and crack from the heat. The workers who tend the steam box become specialists in their own right. They learn to read the signs, to know when the steam production is optimal by the sound it makes entering the box, by the vigor of the wisps escaping through the joints. They learn to judge the time required for different thicknesses of plank, different species of wood, different degrees of curve required. A 3-inch oak plank might need an hour in steam to become pliable enough for the gentle curve at the bilge. But that same plank, if it must be bent to the tight curve near the stem, might need 90 minutes, or even 2 hours if the wood is particularly dense. And the wood itself is not uniform. Oak from the same tree, cut from different positions, will behave differently in steam. Heartwood from the center of the log is denser, harder, more resistant to the penetration of heat and moisture. It requires longer in the steam to achieve the same pliability as sapwood from the outer rings. Wood cut from the northern side of a tree, where growth was slower due to less sun exposure, has tighter grain and greater density than wood from the southern side. The shipwright learns to recognize these differences by eye, by feel, by the weight of the plank in his hands, and he adjusts the steaming time accordingly. There is an art to removing the plank from the steam box as well. The door must be opened quickly to minimize heat loss for the next plank that will be loaded. But the men reaching in to grasp the heartwood must be protected, must have heavy leather gloves or wrappings of wet cloth on their hands. Even so, burns are common. The wood is hot enough to raise blisters through the leather if contact is prolonged. The men grab, lift, pull the plank free, all in one smooth motion that has been practiced until it is second nature. And then the run to the ship. This is where younger, stronger workers are employed, men who can carry the weight of a heavy plank at something approaching a run, who can move quickly without stumbling, without dropping their burden. The distance from steam box to ship might be 50 feet, might be 100 depending on the layout of the yard. Every second counts. The plank is cooling from the moment it leaves the box. The outer surfaces cool fastest, the heat radiating away into the cold air. If the run takes too long, if the men are too slow, the outer surfaces will have stiffened before the plank reaches the frames, even while the interior is still hot. And a plank with a stiff exterior and soft interior is almost impossible to bend evenly. It will kink, will form sharp angles instead of smooth curves, will be ruined. When the plank reaches the ship, the coordination must be perfect. The men carrying it have their assigned positions. The men waiting with clamps have their positions. Everyone knows their role, has practiced the sequence until it flows without conscious thought. The plank is offered up to the frames. The first man positions his end, holds it firm. The second man does the same at his end. The men in the middle support the weight, keep the plank from sagging. The shipwright observes, eyes moving along the length, checking the alignment. A nod, a hand signal. The first clamp goes on. The clamps themselves are simple devices but critical to the work. They are C-shaped pieces of iron, forged by the smith to fit the thickness of the planks being used. One arm of the C goes against the frame, inside the hull. The other arm goes against the outer surface of the plank. A threaded rod passes through both arms, and a wooden handle threads onto the rod. Turn the handle and the two arms draw together, squeezing the plank against the frame. Simple, effective, and capable of generating enormous pressure. The first clamp tightens. The plank begins to bend, resisting at first, and then yielding as the heat within it allows the fibers to slip past each other. You can see it happening, the plank curving, conforming to the shape of the frame. The second clamp goes on, adjacent to the first, adding its pressure. The curve becomes more pronounced. A third clamp, a fourth. Working along the length of the plank, each clamp adding to the accumulated pressure, each one pulling the plank tighter to the frames. And all the while, the wood is groaning. It is an eerie sound, organic and alive, the sound of wood being forced into a shape it did not grow into. The oak fibers on the outside of the curve are being stretched, pulled, elongated beyond their natural state. The fibers on the inside of the curve are being compressed, pushed together, forced to occupy less space than they did when the wood was straight. The sound comes from both, from the stretching and the compressing, from the wood itself protesting this transformation even as the heat makes it possible. Sometimes the groan becomes a crack, sharp, sudden, the unmistakable sound of wood fiber failing under stress. Everyone freezes. Is it a minor check, a small split on the surface that can be ignored or patched? Or is it a major fracture, a failure that runs through the thickness of the plank and renders it useless? The shipwright approaches, examines the plank carefully, running his hands over the surface, feeling for the telltale ridge that indicates a deep split. Sometimes he is fortunate, and the crack is superficial. The work continues. Sometimes he is not, and the plank must be removed and discarded, and the whole process begun again with a fresh piece. But assuming the plank holds, assuming the steaming was correct, and the bending is proceeding without disaster, the fastening begins while the clamps still hold everything in place. The holes for the trunnels have been pre-bored through the frames, positioned to ensure proper spacing and alignment. Now these holes must be extended through the plank, and this must be done while the plank is still clamped in position. The auger is the tool for this work, a long drill bit turned by hand through a wooden cross handle at the top. The worker positions the tip of the auger in the hole in the frame, applies pressure, begins to turn. The bit cuts into the still hot wood of the plank, spiraling through it, creating a hole that matches the diameter of the trunnels that will be driven. This is easier than boring through cold wood, one of the advantages of working with steamed planks. The heat has softened the wood, made it more willing to accept the auger, less likely to splinter or tear. Hole after hole is bored along the length of the plank, perhaps one every 8 inches, perhaps one every foot, depending on the shipwright's judgment of how much fastening is required at this particular part of the hull. When the boring is complete, the trunnels are ready to be driven. The trunnels have been prepared in advance, split from straight-grained oak, shaped roughly round with a draw knife or spoke shave, one end cut to a rough point to help it start into the hole. They are slightly larger in diameter than the holes they will be driven into. This interference fit is what gives them their holding power. When driven home, they compress slightly, and the wood around them compresses slightly, and the whole assembly locks together with a force that will hold for decades. Driving a trunnel is straightforward in principle, but requires skill in execution. The pointed end is positioned at a hole and given a few light taps with a mallet to start it, to ensure it is aligned correctly with the hole. Then the serious striking begins. Heavy blows from a large mallet drive the trunnel deeper, forcing it through the plank and into the frame. The resistance increases as the trunnel goes deeper, as more of its length is engaged in the interference fit. The worker must strike hard enough to keep the trunnel moving, but not so hard that the impacts split the wood or drive the trunnel off course. When the trunnel has been driven as far as it will go, its end should be flush with the outer surface of the plank, or perhaps protruding just slightly. The protruding end, if any, will be trimmed flush later, after the plank has cooled and the full fastening is complete. For now, the trunnel is driven home, locked in place, holding the plank to the frame with a force measured in tons. Trunnel after trunnel is driven, working along the length of the plank, and as the permanent fastenings go in, the clamps can begin to come off. The first clamp is removed, cautiously, to see if the trunnels are holding the plank in position or if it will spring back. If the fastening is adequate, the plank stays put, held by the trunnels even without the clamp pressure. The clamp is moved to the next plank position, ready to be used again. The second clamp is removed, and the third, and gradually the plank transitions from being held by clamps to being held by trunnels, from temporary fastening to permanent. By the time all the clamps have been removed, the plank has cooled significantly. The heat has dissipated into the surrounding air, into the frames, into the other planks adjacent to it. The wood has stiffened, has returned to something approaching its original rigidity, but critically, it has retained the curve. The cooling process, the gradual loss of heat while the plank was held in the curved position, has set the bend. The cellular structure of the wood has reorganized itself around the new shape. The fibers that were stretched remain stretched. The fibers that were compressed remain compressed. And the plank wants to stay curved now rather than straightening out. This is the fundamental transformation that steam bending achieves. It is not simply that the heat makes the wood temporarily flexible. It is that the heat, combined with the mechanical forming while hot, combined with the cooling while still under constraint, permanently alters the structure of the wood. We have convinced the oak that it wants to be curved. We have given it a new memory, a new default shape, and this new shape will persist for the lifetime of the ship. But the work is not quite finished with this plank. The edges must be trimmed, shaped to ensure a proper overlap with the planks above and below. The protruding ends of trunnels must be cut flush and the cuts smoothed. And most importantly, the seam where this plank overlaps the one below must be prepared for caulking. The caulking seam must be the right width and depth. Too narrow and the caulking material cannot be driven in properly, cannot fill the space completely. Too wide and the caulking will fall through, will not provide an adequate seal. The ideal seam is perhaps a 1/4 inch wide, deep enough to accept a good quantity of caulking material, but not so deep that the material cannot be compressed and locked in place. Achieving this ideal requires careful work with planes and chisels, shaping the overlapping edges to create the right gap. The shipwright uses a special tool for this, a rabbet plane designed to cut a precise shoulder into the edge of the lower plank where it is overlapped by the upper. The plane removes thin shavings of oak, gradually creating the correct profile. The work is checked frequently. A scrap of iron or wood of the correct thickness used to gauge the gap. Ensure it is consistent along the length of the overlap. When the seam is correct, it is ready for caulking, but the caulking will not happen immediately. First, all the planks must be in place. The entire hull must be planked from keel to gunwale. Only then will the caulking crews make their systematic way around the ship, filling every seam, ensuring every joint is watertight. This sequencing is important because the hull is not static during construction. As weight is added, as the structure is loaded with deck beams and fittings and ballast, the hull will settle slightly, will shift and adjust. Better to do all the planking first, let the hull find its final shape, and then do all the caulking in one campaign rather than caulking as you go, and then having to redo seams that have shifted. And so we move to the next plank, back to the steam box, where another piece of oak has been soaking in hot vapor for the required time. The cycle repeats. Remove from steam, run to the ship, position, clamp, bore, fasten with trunnels, trim and shape. Another plank, and another. The work continues day after day, each plank representing hours of labor, each one critical to the integrity of the hull. The rhythm of the work becomes almost meditative. You fall into it, your body knowing what to do without conscious thought. The steam bark's crew knows when to load the next plank, when to check the fire, when to add water to the kettle. The runners know their path from barks to ship, can navigate it in the dark if necessary. The clamping crew knows the sequence, knows which clamp goes on first and which second, and how tight to make each one. The boring and fastening crew knows the spacing, knows how to align the auger, knows how hard to strike the mallet when driving trunnels. This is skilled labor, but it is also repetitive labor, and the repetition creates its own challenges. Fatigue sets in, mental and physical. Mistakes are made. A plank is left in steam too long and becomes mushy, unable to hold its shape. A plank is removed too soon and snaps when bent. An auger wanders off course and creates a badly aligned hole. A trunnel is driven too hard and splits the plank. Each mistake is a lesson, reinforcing the need for constant attention, constant care, constant adherence to the proven methods. And through it all, the master shipwright watches. He does not do much of the physical labor himself, not anymore. His value is in his knowledge, his experience, his ability to see problems before they become disasters. He watches the steaming, knows by the sound and the smell when things are right. He watches the bending, knows by the groan of the wood when it is approaching its limits. He watches the fastening, knows by the sound of the mallet on the trunnel when it has been driven to the correct depth. He is everywhere and nowhere, appearing at critical moments, offering guidance, correcting mistakes, teaching the younger workers through demonstration and explanation. The apprentices watch him closely, trying to learn not just what he does, but how he thinks, how he arrives at decisions, how he judges wood and timing, and 1,000 other variables that go into the work. They know that someday they will be master shipwrights themselves, responsible for their own crews, building their own ships. The knowledge they gain here, under this master's guidance, will be the foundation of their future success. The planking continues up the side of the hull. We are perhaps halfway now, the lower curves complete, the long run of the middle planks underway. The work here is slightly easier than at the keel because the curves are gentler, requiring less steaming time, less pressure to bend the wood into conformance with the frames. But easier is relative. It is still hard work, still demanding, still requiring precision and care at every step. As we approach the turn of the bilge, where the hull transitions from its relatively vertical sides to the more horizontal bottom, the curves become complex again. Here the planks must not only bend around the frames, but also twist slightly, following the compound curve of the hull shape. This twisting is perhaps the most difficult deformation to achieve. The steaming must be perfect, the timing must be exact, and the clamping must be carefully orchestrated to introduce the twist gradually, while the plank is being bent to the frame curve. Sometimes, for the most difficult twists, the plank is pre-twisted before it goes to the ship. This is done by clamping the steamed plank to a special jig, a framework that forces the twist, and leaving it there while it cools. The plank retains some of the twist after cooling, making it easier to install on the ship. But this adds time to the process, adds complexity, requires additional equipment and space in the yard. It is done only when necessary, only when the shipwright judges that the twist cannot be achieved during installation. And we must remember that all this work is happening in the open air, exposed to weather. Rain is a constant companion in this part of the world, particularly in autumn and winter when much of the shipbuilding takes place. The rain does not stop the work. It cannot. Ships must be built, contracts must be fulfilled, merchants are waiting for vessels to carry their cargo. So the work continues in the rain, the workers soaked, the mud underfoot becoming deeper and more treacherous, the wood slippery and difficult to handle. The rain has some benefits. It keeps the wood from drying out too quickly after steaming, helps maintain pliability for a few extra minutes. But it also makes the work harder, makes gripping tools more difficult, makes footing uncertain. And if the rain is cold, as it often is, it chills the steamed planks more quickly, reducing the working time even further. The workers must move faster, must be even more efficient, must waste no motion or time. On those days when the rain is particularly heavy, when visibility is reduced and the wind is driving the water sideways, the master shipwright might call a halt to the steaming and planking. Not because the workers cannot endure the conditions, they can and will, but because the quality of the work suffers when working in such conditions. Better to wait for a break in the weather to do the work properly than to rush through it and have to redo planks later because they were poorly fitted or inadequately fastened. But in fair weather, the work proceeds smoothly. The rhythm is maintained. The planks go on one after another, and you can see the hull taking shape, growing upward from the keel, the skeleton of frames gradually being enclosed in its skin of oak. There is satisfaction in this visible progress, in knowing that each day brings the ship closer to completion, closer to launch, closer to the moment when it will first float, and we will know whether all our calculations and assumptions about displacement and stability were correct. The waterline is perhaps the most critical measurement in ship design. Too high, and the ship will not have adequate freeboard, will be swamped by waves in heavy weather. Too low, and the ship will not carry enough cargo to be economically viable. The waterline must be calculated based on the weight of the hull, the weight of the ballast that will be added for stability, the weight of the mast and rigging and fittings, and the weight of the cargo the ship is designed to carry. Get any of these weights wrong, and the ship will not float at the designed waterline. The shipwright has done these calculations in his head, based on experience with similar ships, based on rules of thumb passed down through generations, based on an intuitive understanding of displacement and buoyancy that does not require formal mathematics. He knows that a cog of this size, built with oak planking of this thickness, framed in this manner, will displace approximately this much water when fully loaded. He knows where the water line should fall on the hull, how much of the planking should be below water and how much above, and he has built the ship accordingly, with the planking extending well above the expected water line to provide adequate freeboard. But he will not know for certain until launch whether his calculations were accurate. This is one of the tensions inherent in shipbuilding. You commit to a design, you build to that design over months of labor, and only at the end, when the ship enters the water for the first time, do you learn whether you were right. There is no way to test, no way to verify until the moment of truth. And if you were wrong, if the ship floats too low or too high, corrections must be made. Ballast can be added or removed to adjust the floating position, but if the error is large, more drastic measures might be required. This uncertainty is part of why the master shipwright's experience is so valuable. He has built enough ships, has seen enough launches, has learned from enough mistakes that his intuition is generally reliable. He can look at a hull under construction and visualize how it will float, can judge whether more or less ballast will be needed, can make small adjustments to the design even as it is being built if he senses something is not quite right. As we near the completion of the planking, as the uppermost planks are being fitted, attention turns to the gunwale, the upper edge of the hull. This must be finished properly, must be strong enough to resist the loads from the deck beams and rigging, must provide a good mounting point for the various fittings and cleats that will be needed. The gunwale typically consists of a heavy timber laid along the top edge of the uppermost plank, fastened both to the plank and to the tops of the frames. This gunwale timber ties the structure together, prevents the frames from spreading under load, provides a finished edge to the hull. The gunwale timber is installed in sections, each section perhaps 20 feet long, scuffed together end to end to create a continuous beam running the full length of the ship on each side. The scuffs are carefully cut, long tapered joints that interlock and are fastened with trunnels, creating a joint that is nearly as strong as the solid timber. The gunwale is fitted to the frames. Holes are bored, trunnels are driven, and gradually this final structural element locks everything together. With the gunwale in place, The hull is essentially complete. All the planks are on, all the frames are in place. The keel and stem and sternpost are tied together into a unified structure. What remains is finishing work, details, preparations for the many systems and components that will turn this bare hull into a working ship. But for now, in this moment, we can step back and appreciate what has been accomplished. From a single massive oak tree hewn into a keel, from dozens of curved branches found in the forest and shaped into frames and knees, from hundreds of planks steamed and bent and fastened into place, we have created a hull. It is a beautiful thing in its own right, even unfinished, even lacking the mast and rigging and all the other elements that will make it complete. The curves are fair, flowing smoothly from bow to stern, rising and falling in that subtle sheer line that pleases the eye. The planking is tight, each plank overlapping the next in perfect sequence. The whole structure is rigid, strong, ready to take the loads it will be subjected to. And we know that when this hull enters the water, it will transform. Right now, sitting on its blocks in the mud, it is inert, static, merely a large wooden object. But in the water, it will become something else. It will float, will move, will respond to wind and waves. It will become a ship, a vessel capable of carrying cargo and crew across the northern seas, capable of surviving storms and delivering its burdens safely to port. This transformation from static object to dynamic vehicle is the magic of shipbuilding, the moment when months of labor suddenly reveals its purpose. But we are not quite there yet. The ship must be caulked, must have its seams sealed against the water. The deck must be installed, providing a working platform and adding structural strength. The mast must be stepped, a massive timber perhaps 60 feet tall, fitted into its step and held upright by an elaborate system of standing rigging. The rudder must be hung, connected to the tiller through iron fittings that must be strong enough to withstand the forces of steering in a seaway. The cabin must be built, providing shelter for the crew. The hold must be fitted with flooring and compartments for organizing cargo. 1,000 details remain, each one important, each one requiring skill and time and attention. But the hull is done. The hardest part is behind us. The steaming and bending, the constant battle to convince oak to curve, to flow, to take shapes it did not grow into, this is complete. The planks are in place, locked by trunnels, waiting for the caulking that will make them watertight. We have succeeded in the central challenge of ship construction, building a wooden box that can survive the ocean. And as the light fades and the workers begin to put away their tools, as the fires under the steam boxes are banked for the night, and the pitch cauldrons are covered to retain their heat, there is a sense of accomplishment in the yard. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new tasks, the continuing work of finishing the ship. But tonight, we can rest knowing that we have built well, that the oak we took from the forest has been shaped and joined into something worthy, something that will serve its purpose for years to come. The wharf settles into evening quiet, the sounds of construction fading, replaced by the lap of water against the shore, the call of gulls, the whisper of wind through the skeleton of another ship just beginning to take shape further down the yard. The cycle continues, as it has for centuries, as it will for centuries more. Trees become ships. Ships serve their time and eventually return to the sea or the scrapyard. And always, always, there are new ships to build, new challenges to overcome, new problems to solve. This is the work of the medieval shipwright. This is the knowledge, the skill, the patience required to build fortresses that float. This is how humanity learned to venture onto the chaos of the ocean and survive, through the careful application of techniques developed over generations, through respect for the materials and their properties, through attention to detail and refusal to compromise on quality. And as you drift toward sleep tonight, let the sounds of the shipyard fade into your imagination. The strike of mallet on wood, the groan of oak being bent, the hiss of steam escaping, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of caulking irons. Let these sounds carry you into rest, secure in the knowledge that somewhere, even now, A ship is being built, timber is being shaped, and the ancient craft continues, connecting us to all those who came before and all those who will follow. The ocean waits, the ship rises from the mud, and the work goes on, eternal as the tides. The overlapping begins low, at the garboard strake where hull meets keel. This first plank sets the pattern for everything that follows, and so it receives obsessive attention from the master shipwright. The lower edge must fit precisely against the keel's upper surface, making full contact along its entire length. Any gaps here will leak, will allow water to seep directly into the bilge with nothing to stop it. The upper edge of this first plank will be overlapped by the second plank, and this overlap must be consistent, must be exactly the width the shipwright has determined will provide adequate strength while minimizing weight. 2 inches is common for the overlap, sometimes 2.5. The exact measurement depends on the thickness of the planking, the expected loads, the shipwright's experience with similar vessels. Too narrow an overlap and the joint will be weak, prone to working loose in a seaway when the hull flexes. Too wide and you are adding unnecessary weight, using more timber than required, making the ship heavier and more expensive than it needs to be. But here is the critical insight about clinker construction, the reason it dominates shipbuilding in northern waters. The overlap allows the hull to flex. When a wave strikes the ship, when the bow rises and the stern falls or the ship rolls to one side, the hull does not remain rigid. It cannot. A rigid wooden hull subjected to the forces of a storm sea would shatter like a cup dropped on stone. But a clinker hull, with its overlapping planks fastened at intervals rather than continuously, can flex slightly, can give a little, can absorb the stresses and distribute them along the length of the structure. Each plank can move microscopically relative to its neighbors, sliding a hair's breadth along the overlap, bending slightly between fastening points. These tiny movements, multiplied across the hundreds of planks and thousands of fastenings that make up the hull, allow the entire structure to work, to breathe, to survive forces that would destroy a more rigid construction. The ship becomes almost organic, almost alive, responding to the sea rather than fighting it. The second plank goes on above the first, its lower edge overlapping the upper edge of the garboard strake. The plank is offered up, positioned carefully, checked for fit. The shipwright walks the length of it, sighting along the overlap, ensuring it is consistent from bow to stern. Where the overlap is too wide, he marks the plank, and it is taken down and planed to reduce its width at that point. Where the overlap is too narrow, where the plank does not extend far enough down, adjustments must be made, sometimes by planing the upper edge of the lower plank to create more room. When the fit is satisfactory, when the overlap is correct and consistent, the plank is clamped temporarily in position and the real work of fastening begins. This is the clinching, the driving of iron through wood, the creation of permanent joints that will hold the planks together through years of service. The rivets are not large, 3/8 of an inch in diameter perhaps, sometimes half an inch for the largest vessels. They are made of iron, forged by the smith from rod stock, heated and hammered into shape. Each rivet consists of a shaft perhaps 4 inches long and a head at one end, a flattened disc that will bear against the outer surface of the upper plank. The other end of the shaft is plain, unfinished, waiting to be formed into a second head during the clinching process. The spacing of the rivets is critical. Too far apart, and the overlap will be inadequately supported, will be able to work and flex too much, will eventually fatigue and fail. Too close together, and you are creating unnecessary holes in the wood, weakening it, providing paths for water to enter. 6 inches apart is typical, perhaps 8 inches in areas where the loads are lighter. The shipwright marks the spacing with chalk or scribe, ensuring even distribution along the length of the overlap. The holes for the rivets must be drilled. An awl can pierce thin planking, but for oak 3 inches thick, an auger is required. The worker positions the bit at the first marked spot on the overlap, applies pressure, begins to turn. The spiral of the auger bit cuts into the wood, pulling itself deeper with each rotation, creating a clean round hole through the upper plank and partway into the lower plank. The auger is withdrawn, the hole is clear, ready to receive its rivet. Now comes the moment that gives clinker construction its distinctive sound, the rhythm that echoes across every shipyard where this method is employed. A worker takes position on the outside of the hull, rivet in hand. Another worker takes position on the inside, directly opposite, holding the dolly. The dolly is a heavy block of iron, perhaps 5 pounds, perhaps more, with a flat face that will bear against the rivet shaft. This worker braces himself, presses the dolly firmly against the inside of the lower plank, exactly where the rivet will emerge. The outside worker pushes the rivet through the hole, the plain shaft passing through the upper plank, through the lower plank, emerging on the inside where the dolly waits. Perhaps 2 inches of shaft protrudes beyond the inner surface of the lower plank. This protruding length must be formed into a head, must be deformed and spread to create a second bearing surface that will lock the rivet in place and squeeze the 2 planks together. The inside worker shifts his grip on the dolly, ensuring it is positioned correctly, pressed firmly against the rivet head on the outside of the hull. The dolly will act as an anvil, absorbing the hammer blows, preventing the rivet head from being driven through the plank. The outside worker raises his hammer. It is not a heavy sledge, not a tool for rough work, but a careful instrument, perhaps 2 pounds, with a slightly rounded face that will help shape the rivet end. The hammer falls. It strikes the protruding end of the rivet shaft with a clear, bright note. Ding! The sound carries across the yard, unmistakable, musical almost. The impact deforms the end of the shaft slightly, beginning to spread it. The inside worker responds, his own hammer striking the dolly, driving it firmly against the rivet head, ensuring it stays seated properly. Dong! A deeper note, the sound of iron on iron muffled by the wood between them. Ding! The outside hammer falls again, striking the rivet end from a slightly different angle, spreading it more evenly. Dong! The inside hammer answers, maintaining pressure on the dolly. Ding! Dong! Ding! Dong! The rhythm establishes itself, the 2 workers finding a cadence that works, that efficiently shapes the rivet without wasted motion or effort. The protruding shaft spreads and mushrooms under the repeated blows, gradually forming a second head that bears against the inner surface of the lower plank. The workers can feel when the process is complete, when the rivet has been formed properly. The resistance changes, the sound changes slightly, the rivet feels solid and tight. The hammering stops. The dolly is withdrawn. The rivet is complete, its 2 heads pressing the overlapping planks firmly together, creating a joint that will hold as long as the iron lasts. And the rhythm moves to the next rivet position. Ding, dong, ding, dong. Along the length of the overlap, 6 inches, 8 inches, the next hole, the next rivet, the same process. The rhythm never stops, becomes hypnotic, fills the yard with its distinctive 2-note song. Other workers are riveting other overlaps on other parts of the hull, each pair creating their own rhythm, and together they form a complex percussion that speaks of construction, of progress, of planks being permanently joined into a hull. The work is not quick. Each rivet takes perhaps a minute to form properly, perhaps longer if the worker is less experienced or the rivet proves difficult. With holes spaced every 6 inches along an overlap that might run 20 feet, that is 40 rivets for a single plank overlap. Multiply this by the number of planks, by the number of overlaps, and you begin to understand the scale of the riveting work. Thousands of rivets will be driven before the hull is complete. Thousands of ding-dong rhythms, thousands of mushroomed shaft ends, thousands of iron joints holding oak to oak. Between the rivets, the roves are sometimes employed. A rove is a small iron washer placed over the protruding rivet shaft before the end is formed. The hammering then mushrooms the shaft over the rove, trapping it, using it to distribute the bearing pressure over a larger area of wood. This is particularly important in areas where the loads are high, where the planks might tend to pull apart under stress. The rove prevents the rivet head from pulling through the wood, adds strength to the joint, ensures longevity. The smith produces roves by the hundred, punching them from sheet iron, creating simple washers with a hole slightly larger than the rivet shaft. They are kept in buckets near the riveting stations, ready to be placed as needed. The decision of where to use them and where to rivet without them belongs to the master shipwright, another of the countless judgments he must make based on experience and understanding of loads and stresses. As the planking rises up the hull, as plank after plank is fitted and riveted into place, the distinctive clinker profile emerges. From the outside, you can see the overlaps, the shadow lines where each plank covers the one below, creating horizontal stripes that run the length of the hull. From certain angles, in certain light, these stripes create a beautiful pattern, an expression of structure and method, form-following function in the most direct way. The riveting continues for weeks. The ding-dong rhythm becomes the soundtrack of the yard, the sound everyone associates with this phase of construction. The workers develop calluses on their hands from gripping hammers and dollies. Their arms grow strong from the repetitive motion. They fall into the rhythm so completely that they can work almost without thinking, their bodies knowing what to do while their minds wander. And finally, the last plank is riveted in place. The hull is complete from keel to gunwale, from stem to stern. Every overlap is fastened at the proper intervals. The structure is unified, is whole, is ready for the next phase of making it truly seaworthy. But the riveted overlaps, tight as they are not perfectly watertight. The wood grain, no matter how carefully the planks were sawn, creates microscopic pathways for water. The slight flexing of the hull in a seaway will work the joints, will create tiny gaps that water can exploit. To make the hull truly proof against the sea, every seam must be caulked, must be filled with material that will exclude water even when the hull works and flexes. The caulking material is oakum, and its preparation is a task in itself. Oakum is made from old rope, rope that has served its time aboard ship or in the rigging loft, rope that is too worn or weakened to be trusted with loads but still has use in it. The rope is carefully unraveled, the twisted strands separated, the individual fibers teased apart until what was once a structured rope becomes a mass of loose hemp fibers. These fibers are then impregnated with tar, pine tar, the same black, sticky substance that bubbles in those cauldrons at the end of the yard. The loose fibers are dunked in the hot tar, turned and worked until every fiber is coated, until the tar has penetrated throughout the mass. Then the oakum is removed from the tar and allowed to cool and stiffen somewhat. It remains pliable, workable, but the tar gives it body, makes it easier to handle, and most importantly, makes it waterproof. The prepared oakum is formed into loose ropes or hanks, organized by the workers who will use it, kept ready near the hull. The caulking work begins at the lowest seams and works upward, ensuring that any tar that drips or runs during the work will not mar seams that have already been completed. The caulker takes his position at a seam, the overlap between two planks where the rivets have already locked them together, but where a narrow gap still exists. He takes a strand of oakum from his supply, twists it slightly to compress it, and lays it along the seam. The oakum is perhaps a quarter-inch thick, perhaps a bit more, sized to fit the gap it must fill. In his other hand, the caulker holds the caulking iron. This is not a cutting tool despite its name. It is a flat, blunt instrument, shaped somewhat like a chisel, but without a sharp edge. The face is perhaps 3/4 of an inch wide, the edge squared off, the whole tool designed to compress and drive oakum into seams without cutting or tearing it. The caulker positions the iron against the oakum at one end of the strand, the edge of the tool aligned with the seam. In his other hand, he hefts his beetle, a wooden mallet specifically made for this work. The beetle is heavier than a typical mallet, perhaps 3 pounds, with a large striking face and a comfortable handle worn smooth by use. The beetle rises and falls. Tap. The sound is softer than the ring of hammer on rivet, more of a thud than a clang. The caulking iron compresses the oakum, drives it into the seam. The caulker moves the iron forward a fraction of an inch. Tap. More oakum is driven home. Tap, advance, tap, advance, tap. A rhythm develops, quicker than the riveting rhythm, lighter, a steady tap-tap-tap that carries its own music. The oakum compresses as it is driven into the seam, the tar-coated fibers squeezing together, packing tightly into the available space. The caulker develops a feel for when the oakum is adequately compressed, when it has been driven far enough. Too little, and the oakum will fall out or not provide an adequate seal. Too much and the oakum can be driven completely through the seam, emerging on the inside of the hull, wasted. The first strand of oakum runs the full length of the seam, or as far as the caulker can reach before needing to reposition. When he reaches the end of his comfortable reach, he takes a new strand, overlaps it slightly with the previous one, and continues the tap-tap-tap, driving home more oakum. The work is methodical, almost meditative in its repetition. Position the oakum. Drive it with the iron. Tap, tap, tap. Advance. Tap, tap, tap. Advance. The mind can wander while the body works, the hands knowing what to do without conscious direction. Along a single overlap seam between two 20-foot planks, the caulking might require an hour of steady work. And there are dozens of such seams, perhaps hundreds counting the shorter lengths near bow and stern where planks taper and the geometry becomes more complex. The caulking campaign, working systematically around the entire hull, filling every seam from keel to gunwale, takes days. Weeks if the crew is small or the ship is large. Multiple caulkers work simultaneously, each taking a section of hull, each contributing their tap-tap-tap to the collective rhythm of the yard. The sound carries differently than the riveting did. It is softer, more diffuse, more like rain on a wooden roof than hammer blows on iron. But it is constant, persistent, the sound of careful work being done with attention to detail. The oakum takes on a life of its own in the seams. It wants to spring back, to decompress, to return to its less compact form. But the depth of the seam constrains it, holds it in place. The tar in the fibers helps as well, acting as an adhesive, making the compressed fibers want to stick together, want to remain in the configuration the caulker has driven them into. And when the hull is finally launched, when water pressure begins acting on the seams from the outside, this pressure will further compress the oakum, will drive it more tightly into the gaps, will help create the watertight seal. The caulkers know which seams are most critical, where the water pressure will be greatest, where leaks are most likely to occur if the work is inadequate. The seams low on the hull near the keel, these will be deepest underwater when the ship is loaded. These receive extra attention, might get 2 passes of oakum instead of 1, might be packed more densely. The seams near the waterline, where wave action will constantly work the joint, these too receive special care. As each seam is completed, as the oakum is driven home, and the caulker moves on to the next section, you can see the transformation in the hull. The overlaps, which before showed as simple shadow lines, now have a distinctive bead of compressed oakum visible along their length. The oakum is dark, nearly black from the tar, creating a stripe along each seam that emphasizes the clinker construction, makes the overlapping pattern even more visually apparent. But the caulking alone is not the final step in making the hull watertight. The oakum fills the seams, yes, prevents bulk water flow, yes, but it is not impervious, not perfectly sealed. Water can still wick through the hemp fibers if given time. To create a truly watertight seal, to protect the oakum itself from degrading, to preserve the wood beneath, the entire hull must be paid with tar. Paying is the process of coating, of painting if you will, the hull with hot pine tar. The same tar that was mixed with the oakum fibers, the same tar that bubbles eternally in those iron cauldrons. Now this tar is applied to the exterior of the hull in a thick, protective coating. The tar will seal the wood, will coat the oakum, will create a barrier between the ship and the sea that will last for years if properly maintained. The work begins with heating the tar to the correct temperature. Too cool and it is too viscous to apply smoothly, will clump and leave thick spots and thin spots. Too hot and it becomes dangerously fluid, will run and drip excessively, can cause serious burns if it splashes on skin. The workers tend the fires beneath the cauldrons with care, adjusting the fuel, watching the tar's behavior as it heats. When the tar is ready, when it flows smoothly from the ladle, but retains enough body to coat rather than run, the paying begins. Workers dip long-handled mops into the cauldron, the mop heads soaking up the hot tar. They carry these mops to the hull, moving carefully, the tar steaming slightly in the cool air, droplets occasionally falling from the saturated mop head. The mop is applied to the hull planking with long, smooth strokes, starting at the top and working downward so that any runs or drips will be caught and smoothed by the next stroke. The tar flows onto the wood, soaking into the grain, coating the surface, turning the pale tan of the oak to a deep, glossy black. The smell is intense, sharp, and resinous, the concentrated essence of pine forests, but cleaner somehow, purified by the heating and processing. Over the caulked seams, extra tar is applied, ensuring complete coverage of the oakum, filling any remaining microscopic gaps. The tar penetrates into the compressed oakum, binding it further, creating a composite seal of fiber and pitch that water will not easily breach. Each seam becomes a glossy black stripe running the length of the hull, slightly raised from the surrounding planking, a visible testament to the thoroughness of the caulking beneath. The paying continues around the hull, section by section, each worker coating their assigned area, the black spreading like a shadow across the oak. This is not delicate work. The hot tar gets everywhere, on tools and clothes and hands and arms. The workers who do the paying become marked by it, their skin stained dark, their clothes permanently impregnated with tar that no amount of washing will completely remove. But they take a certain pride in this, the tar stains being a badge of their trade, proof of their involvement in this critical work. As the tar cools on the hull, it hardens somewhat, losing the liquid gloss, becoming more matte, more solid. But it retains flexibility, will not become brittle, will move with the wood as the hull works in a seaway. This flexibility is critical. A rigid coating would crack, would separate from the wood, would fail to provide protection. But tar, with its complex mixture of resins and oils, remains pliable, remains bonded to the wood, continues to seal even as the hull flexes. The paying is completed over several days, working carefully to ensure complete coverage, to avoid holidays or thin spots where water might find a way through. When the final section has been coated, when the entire hull from keel to gunwale gleams with fresh tar, there is a moment of satisfaction. The ship now looks the part, looks like a proper vessel, its hull sealed against the sea, ready to face the water for which it was designed. But it has not yet touched that water. It still sits on its blocks in the yard, suspended above the mud and the shallow water at the edge of the channel. The deck is being fitted now, the beams in place, the planking going down, the cargo hold taking shape beneath. The mast step is being fitted, that massive block of oak that will receive and distribute the forces from the mast. The rudder is being hung, the pintles and gudgeons that form its hinges being forged and fitted. The work continues for days, for weeks. But finally, the preparations for launch begin. The hull must be moved to the slipway, must be positioned above the greased timbers that will guide its descent into the water. Cradles are built around the hull, supporting it, holding it steady while the blocks beneath are knocked away. The ship's weight settles onto these cradles, and then the whole assembly, ship and cradles together, must be moved sideways, inched toward the slipway. This takes every available worker, takes levers and rollers, and an enormous amount of coordinated effort. But gradually, the ship moves, slides sideways on wooden rollers greased with tallow, approaching the slipway. When it is finally positioned correctly, When the cradles sit properly on the greased timbers of the slipway, the preparations are complete. The tide is considered carefully. The launch must happen at or near high tide, when the water at the bottom of the slipway is deep enough to float the ship immediately upon entry. Launch at low tide, and the ship might stick in the mud, might settle awkwardly, might suffer damage. The timing must be right. The morning of the launch arrives clear and calm, a gift from the weather that is not taken for granted. The restraining ropes are attached, heavy lines running from the ship to posts and bollards, controlled by teams of workers who will manage the descent, will prevent the ship from rushing down the slipway out of control. The master shipwright walks around the hull one final time, checking everything, looking for any last detail that might have been overlooked. He finds nothing amiss. The ship is ready. At the signal, the restraining ropes are slowly paid out. The ship begins to move, the greased slipway offering minimal resistance. Slowly at first, just inches, and then faster, the weight beginning to pull it downward. The workers controlling the ropes strain, taking up the slack, providing resistance, controlling the speed of descent. The ship accelerates, moving faster now, the slipway squealing and smoking despite the grease. The bow reaches the water. The moment of contact sends a shiver through the hull, a subtle vibration that every worker can feel. The bow dips into the water, pushing it aside, creating a wave that radiates outward. More of the hull enters the water, more and more, the buoyancy beginning to take effect, beginning to lift the forward sections even as the stern continues down the slipway. And then the magic moment. The entire hull is in the water, no longer touching the slipway, no longer supported by anything but its own buoyancy, by the displacement of water, by the fundamental principle that an object will float if it weighs less than the water it displaces. The restraining ropes go slack. The ship is floating, free, independent. It bobs slightly, adjusting to the movement of the water, finding its natural trim. The waterline emerges exactly where the shipwright calculated it would be, confirming that the weight estimates were accurate, that the hull displaces the correct amount of water, that the ship will carry its designed cargo without riding too low. There is a collective exhalation among the workers, a release of tension that has been building through months of construction. The ship floats. It floats true and level. The work was good. The hull settles into the water, the oak planking making small creaking sounds as it adjusts to its new element, as water pressure begins acting on the seams, as the structure takes on the loads it was designed for. The oakum in the seams compresses slightly more. The tar coating softens just a bit in the water. The trunnels swell slightly as moisture penetrates them. All these tiny adjustments, these accommodations to the new environment, they are normal, expected, part of the ship's transformation from yard construction to waterborne vessel. The tide rocks the hull gently, a slow rhythm that is almost soothing. The ship rises and falls perhaps 6 inches with each passing swell, the movement regular, predictable, the fundamental motion that this vessel will experience for the rest of its working life. The timber settles into this rhythm, the structure learning how to move as a unified whole rather than as separate pieces held together by fastenings. The workers secure the ship to the dock with mooring lines, ensuring it will not drift away with the tide or wind. They will leave it here for some hours, watching, checking for leaks, making sure the caulking holds, that the tar coating is adequate, that no water is making its way into the bilge faster than can be managed with the pump. This is the proof of their work, this first floating, this test of whether months of labor have resulted in a sound vessel. Inside the hull, workers descend into the hold with lanterns, examining the seams from within, looking for any sign of water penetration. They find some moisture, yes, a little seepage here and there where the seams are working, where the wood is still adjusting to being in water. But nothing serious, nothing that suggests a problem. The oakum is holding. The ship is watertight. As the afternoon wears on, as the tide begins to ebb, the ship settles lower on its mooring lines, following the falling water level. The hull remains sound, remains dry, continues to float true. The master shipwright allows himself a small smile. The ship is good. The construction was sound. All the decisions made over the months of building, all the care taken with materials and methods, all the skill of the workers, it has resulted in a vessel worthy of the ocean. The work is not entirely complete. There is still rigging to install, still fittings and equipment to be added, still provisions and ballast to be loaded before the ship can make its first voyage. But the hull is done. The fortress that floats has been proven to float. The hardest part, the most critical part, is behind them. As evening approaches, as the workers begin to leave the yard, heading home to their families, to their evening meals, to their rest, the ship remains at the dock, gently moving with the tide, settling into its new existence. The tar gleams dully in the fading light. The overlapping planks create their distinctive pattern of shadow lines. The whole structure speaks of craftsmanship, of knowledge applied, of materials respected and used according to their nature. Tonight, the ship will remain here, moored securely, watched over by a guard who will check periodically for problems, who will pump the bilge if needed, who will ensure no harm comes to this new vessel. The tide will continue its eternal rhythm, rising and falling, and the ship will rise and fall with it, learning the motion, settling into the patterns that will define its working life. And as the tide gently rocks the finished hull, lifting it from the cradle of the earth, the ship finds its purpose. The work is done. Sleep well.